The spotlight burned hot and merciless on the polished wooden stage, reflecting in shards of light that seemed almost cruel in their sharpness. A boy stood frozen at its center, his chest heaving, bow trembling in his grip, and from his violin, once the pride of his young life, hung a single string, snapped and dangling like the limp thread of a severed lifeline. The sound it had made when it broke still echoed faintly in the hall, like the last cry of a bird with broken wings. A collective gasp rippled through the audience, sharp and immediate, a living wave of disbelief. Mothers pressed their hands to their lips, fathers shook their heads, children clutched each other, and somewhere, someone muttered what everyone was thinking: "It's over." At the judges' table, 3 heads leaned together in hurried whispers. Their pens, poised moments before to score brilliance, now scratched tentative notes in margins of despair. "Unprepared," one murmured. "Unlucky," said another. But the third leaned back with a faint smirk, as though convinced fate itself had intervened to settle the night. From the corner of the stage, a rival watched, his smile not of sympathy but of satisfaction. He had played earlier, his performance smooth, his notes precise, his confidence unshakable. And now, with the boy's failure unfolding in front of everyone, that rival's grin widened ever so slightly, smug and victorious. To him the competition was already decided. The boy stood paralyzed, his heart pounding louder than any applause or silence. Every eye in the room pinned him to the spot. The violin, that fragile vessel of memory and sacrifice, now seemed nothing more than an empty wooden shell. He could feel the shame rising in his throat, a bitter flood he wanted to swallow but couldn't. Somewhere in the back row, a woman shifted in her seat, her gaze steady, unblinking, unwavering. She was dressed plainly, unnoticed by most, but her eyes did not flinch. They carried no pity, no panic, only a quiet fire that refused to go out. She knew what this moment really was. She knew what those broken strings meant and what they didn't. But the hall didn't see her. They saw only a boy defeated, an ending before it even began. One judge shook his head slowly, already reaching for the bell that would signal disqualification. The rival cleared his throat in mock patience, eager to savor triumph. The boy's knuckles whitened on the bow. His lips parted, but no sound came. The silence stretched so long it began to ache. And then, just as the audience braced for collapse, the lights flickered above, the room seemed to tighten with unseen gravity, and the narrator's voice seemed to whisper through the silence itself. But no one in that hall knew the truth about the hands that would soon build history. From the moment he first held the violin, the boy felt as though he had found the missing piece of himself. It was not just wood and strings, it was a voice he never knew he had. At 12, while other children chased games in the street, he chased notes that shimmered in the air like silver light. He practiced until his fingers blistered, until the pads of his fingertips grew calloused, until the bow became as natural in his hand as breath in his lungs. Late into the night, when the city's noises had quieted into the hum of distant traffic and the sighs of sleeping neighbors, he would draw his bow across the strings and let the music pour. Hours slipped unnoticed. Shadows crept across his small bedroom walls, but he played on, chasing perfection as though the next phrase might unlock a doorway to destiny. His teacher said he had talent, but he knew it wasn't talent alone. It was hunger. It was fire. It was the dream of climbing above everything ordinary and proving once and for all that he was meant for more. But with every crescendo came a shadow he could not shake. That shadow was not the rival who mocked him at school, nor the critics who doubted his worth. The shadow lived in his own home. Every morning, when he sat at the small kitchen table with his violin case beside him, his mother would rush out the door in her faded uniform, apron strings tied at her waist, hair pulled back hastily. She worked as a waitress at the corner diner, balancing trays with tired grace, smiling through exhaustion for customers who never bothered to learn her name. He loved her deeply, he always would, but a quiet shame burned inside him when classmates asked what his parents did. Their parents were doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs. His mother carried plates. He never said it to her face, but sometimes when she asked about his recitals, about his lessons, about his progress, his answers grew shorter. He didn't want her to come to his competitions, not dressed in that uniform, not smelling faintly of grease and coffee. He wanted to win, to rise, to prove himself. But deep down he feared that no matter how high he climbed, others would always see the truth of where he came from. A waitress's son. At night, lying in bed after hours of practice, He would stare at the ceiling and fight the guilt that twisted in his stomach. She worked herself to the bone to pay for his lessons, his sheet music, his instrument. He knew it. He had seen her fingers, cracked from endless hours carrying trays, slip quietly into his case when she thought he wasn't looking, adjusting the bow hairs so they wouldn't fray. She didn't know much about violins, or so he thought, but she tried. And yet, when other kids laughed at his background, a bitter heat rose in his chest, and he found himself wishing his mother could be someone else. Someone respected. Someone admired. The violin became his escape. With every note he played, he tried to build a new identity, one that had nothing to do with her apron or her long shifts at the diner. He believed if he played well enough, if he won enough, he could rewrite who he was. Music was not just his passion. It was his salvation. Still, there were moments that gnawed at him. Sometimes, when he returned from late practice, he'd find her asleep at the table, a cup of cold tea by her side, his tuition bill open in front of her. Her face, lined with fatigue, looked older than her years. And in those moments he hated himself for the shame he felt. He wanted to hug her, to thank her, to tell her she was the reason his bow could fly. But the words stuck in his throat. His classmates didn't understand why he stayed after hours, practicing until the custodian flicked the lights. They didn't see the way his hands trembled when he imagined losing. They didn't hear the thoughts that whispered in the back of his mind. If you fail, everything she sacrificed will mean nothing. And so he practiced harder. He played until the world narrowed into strings and sound. He ignored the ache in his wrists, the bruises on his chin where the violin rested, the stiffness of his shoulders. Every piece of pain became fuel. Every hour stolen from sleep was an offering to the dream. But dreams are fragile things like violins themselves. One snap of a string, one careless hand, one cruel rival, and it could all fall apart. He didn't know yet that the woman he feared the world might judge was not only stronger than the jeering of strangers, but carried within her a story that could eclipse his shame with pride. He didn't know that behind those weary hands was a mastery few in the world could match, a past she had buried not out of weakness but sacrifice. All he knew was the sound of his bow against the strings, the late-night hum of his mother's key in the lock as she returned home, and the haunting question he could never silence. Was it enough? He believed his music could build him a future. What he didn't know was that his mother's hidden past was already building his destiny. And soon the world would learn the truth he had never dared to imagine. For Marcus, life had always been wrapped in velvet. From the polished floors of his family's estate to the glossy brochures of elite academies, privilege wasn't something he thought about. It was the air he breathed. He grew up in a house where servants ironed his shirts, where chauffeurs waited in gleaming cars, where meals were plated like art before him. From the moment he was old enough to lift a bow, he had the best teacher's money could buy. His violin wasn't rented or borrowed. It was a handcrafted masterpiece from Cremona, purchased at a price most families couldn't earn in a decade. From the outside, he seemed untouchable. The golden child, the prodigy, the one destined for greatness. Parents at recitals whispered his name like a charm. Judges leaned in when he played, already convinced they were in the presence of excellence. He wore confidence like a second skin, striding into competitions with tailored suits and the calm certainty that comes from knowing the world has already prepared a throne. But inside, Marcus carried a storm. Because no matter how much polish he poured into his performance, no matter how perfectly he executed each passage, there was always someone else. The boy with nothing, who played as if the music came from his very blood. That boy was Daniel. The son of a waitress, the immigrant kid who practiced in a cramped apartment, who wore shoes with scuffed edges to rehearsals, who carried his violin in a case mended with tape. Daniel should have been invisible in Marcus's world. Yet every time Marcus heard him play, something inside twisted. Daniel's sound wasn't just correct. It was alive. It breathed, it bled, it soared in ways Marcus's carefully polished notes never could. Marcus would never admit it aloud, but he envied him. He envied the raw hunger, the authenticity that no private tutor could teach. It wasn't that Daniel was technically better. Marcus knew he could execute scales and arpeggios with flawless precision, but talent is not always measured in perfection. Daniel's music carried weight. It carried struggle. It carried heart. And when the bow cut into strings, audiences leaned in, spellbound, as though hearing truth itself. Marcus hated that. He hated that despite his wealth, his privilege, his pedigree, he couldn't summon that same fire. He hated the way teachers praised Daniel's natural gift, as if Marcus's years of study were worth less because they came from comfort instead of hardship. Worst of all, he hated the way people compared them. Two boys on the same stage, one with everything, the other with nothing. Yet somehow it was the boy with nothing who left deeper echoes in the hall. At first, Marcus told himself it didn't matter. He would still win. He had the resources, the connections, the reputation. But the whispers grew louder. Judges frowned at his sterile precision. Audiences clapped politely for his brilliance, but they leapt to their feet for Daniel's soul. Each ovation felt like a knife. Jealousy seeped into every corner of his mind. Why should Daniel, the son of a diner waitress, rise so high? Why should a boy who hadn't spent summers in Salzburg, who hadn't studied with the maestros of Vienna, be spoken of in the same breath as him? Marcus began to feel cheated, as though fate itself had betrayed him. And so the bitterness festered. It showed in small ways at first. A sneer during rehearsals. A whispered comment to other competitors mocking Daniel's patched-up clothes. A roll of the eyes when Daniel's name was announced. But beneath those surface gestures, a darker thought was taking root. If Daniel couldn't be outplayed, perhaps he could be undone. That thought became an obsession. At night, while others slept, Marcus lay awake, not thinking of his own music but of Daniel's downfall. He imagined headlines stripped of the immigrant boy's triumph. He imagined stages where Daniel stood humiliated, strings broken, dreams crushed. The more Marcus thought of it, the more it felt like justice, not cruelty. In his mind, Daniel had stolen something that wasn't his to have. If Marcus had been born with everything, then surely he deserved to keep everything. The sabotage wasn't planned in a single moment. It crept forward, step by step, until it felt inevitable. He began with rumors, dropping subtle suggestions to judges and peers. I heard Daniel's technique is a little unrefined. Or, some say he pushes too hard on the strings. It won't last. He told himself it was harmless, just tilting the scales back where they belonged. But when the whispers didn't stop Daniel's rise, Marcus knew he had to go further. He began watching Daniel closely, memorizing his habits, his rituals, his case, his bow. He noticed how Daniel always tuned his violin backstage, how he left the case briefly unattended before walking on. He noticed the fragile wear in the strings, the small vulnerabilities born of relentless practice. And Marcus's mind, sharpened by jealousy, began to see opportunities. He justified it all in silence. This is balance, he told himself. This is order. The son of a waitress does not surpass me. The immigrant boy does not outshine me. Each act of bitterness he considered felt less like sabotage and more like destiny correcting itself. Yet deep down, a voice whispered what he refused to admit. Marcus wasn't fighting Daniel. He was fighting himself. He was fighting the hollow echo inside, the truth he could never say aloud, that all the money, all the privilege, all the polish in the world could not buy the kind of soul that Daniel poured into a single note. And so the rivalry was set. One boy fueled by hunger and sacrifice. The other by privilege curdling into jealousy. On competition night, when the world's eyes would be fixed upon the stage, Marcus wasn't just preparing to play his piece. He was preparing to strike where Daniel was most vulnerable. For in Marcus's world, defeat was unthinkable. And if victory required breaking more than strings, then so be it. Because in his mind only one could stand in the spotlight. And he would make sure it was him. The academy looked like something out of a dream. Arched ceilings that seemed to touch the sky, hallways where oil portraits of past prodigies glared down with imperious pride, and practice rooms lined with polished wood that glowed beneath golden lamps. For the chosen few, it was a palace of music, a sanctuary where talent was molded into legend. But for Daniel it felt like entering another planet. On his very first day he noticed it. The way the other students' shoes shone, the way their blazers were tailored, the way their laughter echoed in polished marble corridors as if the building itself recognized their belonging. He tightened his grip on his second-hand violin case, the latch still loose from years of wear, and walked past them quietly, a shadow moving through a kingdom not built for him. The academy prided itself on being inclusive, yet inclusion had limits that weren't written in handbooks. It wasn't about rules. It was about glances, whispers, the small invisible daggers that pierced deeper than any insult spoken aloud. Daniel felt them all. At orientation, a boy smirked at his shoes and said just loud enough to be heard, Guest scholarships don't cover wardrobes. At lunch, he found himself alone at a table while others clustered together, trading stories of summer recitals in Vienna, masterclasses in Paris, competitions in New York. Daniel's summer had been spent bussing tables at his mother's diner and practicing until his fingers blistered. He kept that story to himself. The teachers were divided about him. Some looked at him with admiration, seeing in his determination a reminder of why music mattered in the first place. They praised his work ethic, the way he threw himself into practice as if each note carried the weight of survival. One conductor murmured after a rehearsal, "That boy plays like he's fighting for his life." But others were not so kind. They spoke with the clipped tones of polite skepticism. "Technically competent," one remarked, "but a bit rough around the edges." Another leaned over during a faculty meeting and said, "Talent, yes, but one wonders how far grit alone can take him." And though Daniel wasn't meant to hear these words, he felt their weight in the way certain teachers' eyes lingered, in the way their comments during lessons always seemed sharper, harsher, as if daring him to prove he belonged. The students, meanwhile, wove their cruelty into everyday moments. They mocked his accent when he spoke too quickly, imitating his mother's voice when she called for him after class. They pointed at his worn-out notebooks, at his scuffed shoes, at the fact that he never joined them in the cafe across the street. He didn't have the money for overpriced lattes and macarons. Instead, he sat in the practice rooms eating the sandwich his mother packed for him, while his bow moved furiously across the strings. There were bigger humiliations too. At one recital, a string snapped mid-performance. It happens to every violinist eventually, but when it happened to Daniel, the gasps were different. He saw the smirks in the crowd, heard the whispers, "Unprepared. Cheap instrument. Not Academy material." He finished the piece anyway, sweat dripping down his brow, heart hammering, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a collapse. The applause was lukewarm, but inside he knew he had won, because he hadn't bowed to their expectations. And yet the loneliness stung. There were nights when he sat alone in the dormitory, his mother's voice replaying in his head, "You're not less than anyone, Daniel. Remember that." But when the lights dimmed and laughter echoed from other rooms, he couldn't help but wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe he didn't belong. Maybe the academy wasn't built for boys like him. Still he persisted. He rose before dawn to practice scales until his fingers grew numb. He stayed long after classes ended, bow dancing over strings in empty rehearsal halls. When the others went out on weekends, he stayed behind, replaying passages until every note became second nature. Music wasn't just his dream. It was his rebellion, his way of pushing back against every sneer, every whisper, every door that had been slammed in his face. There were glimmers of recognition. A teacher who had doubted him paused one day after class, listening to the aching beauty of his tone. For a moment her expression softened. She didn't say anything, but she lingered longer than usual, as though words weren't needed. Another time, during a masterclass, he played a piece so full of sorrow and triumph that even his rival Marcus, watching from the corner, clenched his jaw and looked away. But with recognition came more hostility. Marcus and his circle of friends ramped up their cruelty. They joked about Daniel's diner hands, saying his fingers looked better suited to washing dishes than playing an instrument. They teased him about his lunch, calling it immigrant food. One day Marcus accidentally knocked over Daniel's violin case, sending the instrument tumbling onto the floor. Daniel picked it up, checked for cracks, and said nothing even as rage boiled inside him. He refused to give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead he poured it all into the music. Every insult became a bow stroke, every humiliation a note, every slight an echo that built into something larger than himself. His sound deepened, became more haunting, more powerful. Audiences might not have known why, but when Daniel played they felt something primal. A mixture of pain and resilience, beauty and defiance. Still, the Academy made sure he never forgot his place. Invitations to exclusive performances somehow never reached him. His name was left off the list of those recommended for prestigious scholarships. When parents came to watch rehearsals, some looked at him curiously, then turned away as if he were a mistake in the program. Yet Daniel endured. He endured because every time he thought of giving up, he saw his mother's tired hands setting down a plate of food after a double shift, her smile despite the exhaustion. He endured because he carried the weight of every sacrifice she had made, every dream she had deferred, every humiliation she had swallowed so he could stand where she never could. The academy could sneer, could doubt, could humiliate, but it could not silence him. And though he didn't know it yet, each day of persistence, each battle endured in silence, was shaping him into something the academy had never seen before. For Daniel was not just learning music. He was learning survival. He was learning how to turn every act of exclusion into fire, every act of cruelty into strength. And when the moment came, when the stage lights blazed and the audience hushed, his bow would carry all of it, every scar, every bruise, every insult transformed into sound. In that way, the academy, for all its cruelty, was building the very thing it feared most. A boy who could not be broken. And soon, everyone within those polished walls would learn what it meant to underestimate the son of a waitress. Morning always came too soon for Elena. She would rise before the sun, fingers stiff from the previous night's work, and slip into her faded uniform. The diner apron smelled faintly of coffee and grease no matter how many times she washed it. She tied it around her waist with a weary grace, tucking stray strands of hair beneath her cap, and forced a smile into place, the mask she wore for the world. The diner was her stage. From the moment she pushed through the swinging door into the clatter of plates and hiss of fryers, she became someone else. She laughed at jokes that weren't funny, soothed cranky customers with honeyed words, and carried trays that grew heavier each year. Her body ached from double shifts, but she walked with practiced lightness, her exhaustion hidden beneath the practiced rhythm of a waitress's performance. To the outside world, Elena was ordinary, another tired woman with tired eyes, surviving paycheck to paycheck. But inside she held something deeper, something she refused to let the world see. Her son, Daniel, saw her exhaustion but never her pride. He saw the lines deepening on her forehead, the way her hands trembled when she counted out change late at night. He saw the way she collapsed into the couch after work, kicking off her shoes with a sigh that filled the room. Sometimes he caught her staring at the ceiling, as if replaying a memory he could never touch. But when he asked, "Mom, are you okay?" she always smiled. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't worry about me." And he believed her, or pretended to. He carried guilt in silence. Every time she returned home after midnight with sore feet and swollen ankles, he told himself he would work harder, play better, become someone worthy of all she endured. He didn't know that she already believed he was worth more than gold. What Daniel never saw was the pride she carried in secret. Because Elena had once been more than a waitress. Before America, before the endless shifts and tips that never stretched far enough, she had lived another life. Back home, in a small workshop tucked beneath a crooked roof, she had worked with wood and varnish, carving life into silence. She had been a violin maker. Not a famous one, not yet, but her instruments had found their way into the hands of wandering musicians, each one carrying a piece of her soul. Her father had taught her. She still remembered the smell of spruce and maple, the fine shavings curling to the floor, the way the light hit a freshly polished backplate until it glowed like amber. She had learned to measure sound not just by tone but by heartbeat, shaping curves that caught resonance like a secret whispered to the universe. Music was not something she played, it was something she built. But when she left her country, she left that world behind. She told no one. Not even Daniel. Especially not Daniel. Why? Because shame shadowed her pride. To her, violin making was not a grand career. It was a past tied to dreams that had collapsed beneath the weight of survival. In America, people respected doctors, lawyers, CEOs, not immigrants who carved wood in back rooms. And so she buried it. She traded varnish-stained hands for diner trays, maple dust for the scent of burnt coffee, resonance for the clatter of plates. Her son only saw the mask. He never knew that, some nights after he fell asleep, Elena would sit at the kitchen table with a block of scrap wood she couldn't afford to waste. She would run her fingers over it, closing her eyes as though touching an old friend. Sometimes, when loneliness pressed too hard, she would take out a set of tiny chisels wrapped in cloth, tools she had smuggled from home. She never used them in full. She only held them, then tucked them away before dawn as though ashamed of even remembering. The silence of her sacrifice was deafening. And yet it shaped everything. When Daniel practiced late into the night, Elena would sit just beyond the doorway listening. She would hear the imperfections others might miss, the bow dragging too heavy on one note, the resonance faltering on another. Her heart would ache to correct him, to tell him the secrets of wood and sound, to teach him how an instrument itself breathes. But she stayed quiet. He must never know. Why? Because she wanted his dream to be his own. If he learned of her past, would he think his gift was borrowed from her hands? Would he carry the burden of her unfulfilled ambitions? Elena could not allow that. He deserved freedom, not chains of inheritance. So she kept silent, and every note he played became her unspoken pride. The world only saw a waitress. Her son only saw exhaustion. But within her she knew, every plate she carried, every tip she pocketed, every hour of her life traded away was part of something larger. She wasn't just working for survival. She was building a stage for him. Yet the mask grew heavier with each passing year. There were days when customers sneered at her accent, asking her to repeat herself as though her words were broken. She smiled anyway. There were nights when drunks left pennies as tips, muttering that she should be grateful for even that. She smiled anyway. There were mornings when she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. The lines deeper, the spark dimmer. And still she tied her apron and smiled. The mask never slipped in public. But behind closed doors, in the stillness of their small apartment, it sometimes cracked. She would sit in the dark, hands cradling an invisible violin, remembering the instruments she once made, the music she once shaped. And then she would hear Daniel stir in his room, and immediately she would wipe her eyes, reassemble her smile and greet him with warmth. "Morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" Always the mask. And Daniel, though perceptive, never pierced it fully. He saw her tiredness but mistook it for weakness, never realizing it was strength disguised as fragility. He thought she worked because she had no choice, never knowing she had once chosen to give up everything so that he could choose freely. Her secret past remained buried, but like all secrets, it whispered beneath the surface. It shaped the way she listened to his playing, the way her eyes glistened when he mastered a difficult passage, the way her heart clenched when he spoke of being ashamed that his mother was just a waitress. He didn't know. He couldn't know. Not yet. And so Elena wore her mask faithfully, waitress by day, silent violin maker by memory, mother always. But there would come a day when the mask could no longer hold, when truth would bleed into light. For now, though, she bore her silence like a cross, letting the world think her ordinary, while inside she carried a history that, if revealed, might shatter her son's shame and replace it with awe. Until that day she walked the diner floors with aching feet and a hidden heart, hiding her pride in plain sight. Because her son's dream was worth every secret she kept, every bruise she hid, every mask she wore. And though Daniel did not yet know it, his story was already entwined with hers, his music already echoing a lineage of sound carved from silence. The hallways of the academy were colder that night, though no one would admit it. The lights were dimmed for the final rehearsal before the competition, and tension hung in the air like the residue of a storm. Every whisper seemed sharper, every laugh edged with rivalry. The immigrant boy cradled his violin, the one constant companion through sleepless nights, through sweat and silent tears. Its polished wood caught the glow of the chandeliers above, reflecting not just light but history, the unseen fingerprints of his mother, the endless hours of his practice, the unspoken dreams carved into every curve of the instrument. But tonight a shadow followed him. His rival, the son of wealth and privilege, stood across the room, his bow resting lazily in his hand, his smirk more venomous than any insult. To the world it was just another competition. To him it was a battleground where dignity would either be crushed or vindicated. The immigrant boy had spent the last week practicing to the brink of collapse. His fingers were calloused, his nails broken, his eyes red from chasing perfection. He believed that when he stepped onto that stage his music would silence every doubt, every insult, every microaggression whispered behind his back. But his rival had other plans. During rehearsal, the boy placed his violin gently on the chair beside him as he stretched his stiff shoulders. In that fleeting moment of vulnerability, privilege and envy collided. The rival walked over, slow and deliberate, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. He lifted the violin as though admiring it, turning it in his hands with feigned curiosity. The boy, sensing danger, spun around, his heart lurching. "Put it down," he said, his voice steady but laced with panic. The rival smiled, a smile that wasn't joy but cruelty masquerading as charm. "It's funny," he said, tilting the violin so the chandelier light danced along its surface. How something this ordinary can mean so much to someone like you. Before the boy could reach him, the rival tightened his grip, raised the violin high, and with one swift, merciless motion, slammed it against the edge of the chair. The crack echoed like a gunshot through the empty hall. The strings snapped violently, one coiling into the air like a whip, another dangling limp and broken. The wood splintered, the sound box fractured, and the soul of the instrument seemed to bleed into silence. For a heartbeat, time froze. The immigrant boy stood there, paralyzed, his chest hollow, his lungs refusing to draw breath. His violin, his lifeline, his voice, lay shattered on the floor. The rival bent down slowly, almost mockingly, and brushed a finger along the broken wood. "Guess we'll see what talent looks like without a crutch," he whispered, his words venom dripping into the silence. Then he straightened up, brushing invisible dust from his designer jacket, and walked away with a satisfied smirk, leaving shards of wood and shards of a dream scattered in his wake. The boy collapsed to his knees, gathering the pieces with trembling hands. His fingers ran along the fractured curves as though he could will them back together, as though his touch might heal what had been broken. But the more he tried, the more splinters dug into his skin. His chest tightened, his throat burned. It wasn't just an instrument. It was his identity, his anchor, the bridge between him and his mother's sacrifices. Every note he had played, every tear shed in practice, every moment of doubt conquered, it all lived inside that violin. And now, in one cruel gesture, it was gone. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, thick with disbelief. Even the other students, who often joined in mocking whispers, stood frozen. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Others looked away, unwilling to confront the brutality of what had just unfolded. But no one spoke. No one intervened. The boy wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out. Instead, he clutched the broken violin to his chest, rocking slightly, his eyes burning but refusing to spill tears. He wouldn't give his rival the satisfaction of seeing him break. But deep inside, something cracked. He thought of his mother, who worked herself into exhaustion to afford his tuition, who carried trays heavier than her small frame should ever bear, who returned home with blistered feet but still kissed him on the forehead and asked about his practice. How could he face her now? How could he explain that the one thing connecting him to his dream, to her silent sacrifices, had been destroyed? The rival watched from a distance, leaning casually against the wall, his smirk never fading. To him, it wasn't just about winning the competition. It was about erasing a boy who didn't belong, a boy whose presence was a threat to his inherited superiority. But what he didn't know was that he hadn't broken just a violin. He had awakened something far more powerful. The immigrant boy sat there, clutching the fragments, his jaw tight, his body trembling. At that moment, despair and determination collided within him. He could surrender to humiliation or he could rise from it. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory flickered. His mother's hands, calloused yet delicate, shaping wood with quiet precision. Her eyes lingering on the violin when she thought he wasn't looking. Her silence about her past. Perhaps she knew something he didn't. The crack of the violin still echoed in his ears, but beneath it, another sound began to rise, not from the hall but from within him. A sound like the faint stirring of resolve, the kind that grows stronger in the silence after devastation. The crowd would see a broken boy. His rival would see victory. But none of them knew what history was about to be carved from the ruins. Because while one boy had shattered wood, he had unknowingly struck the very spark that would ignite a fire far greater than himself. And that fire was only just beginning to burn. But what happened after that night would turn whispers of pity into shouts of awe, and silence into music the world would never forget. The house was dark when they returned from the academy that night. The boy had not spoken a word on the walk home, and his mother did not ask. She saw the way he held the broken violin case to his chest, as though he were clutching a dying friend, and she knew better than to force words from him before he was ready. The streets outside had gone quiet, save for the occasional hiss of tires on wet asphalt. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the air damp and cold, pressing down like a heavy blanket. The boys' footsteps dragged on the wooden steps leading to their small rented apartment, each creak louder than the last. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of old coffee and fried onions. Normally, his mother would set about cooking something to distract him, but tonight she moved differently. Slower, deliberate, as if weighed down by an invisible secret. He collapsed onto the couch without removing his shoes, still cradling the violin case. When he opened it, the jagged pieces of wood lay exposed in the pale yellow light of the living room lamp. His hands hovered over them, then fell limp to his knees. No tears came. Only silence, thick and suffocating. His mother stood in the doorway watching. For years she had hidden parts of herself, burying her past beneath double shifts, grease-stained aprons, and the clatter of plates. She had told herself it was to protect him, to keep him focused on building his own story. But tonight, as she saw the raw devastation in his eyes, she understood. The time for silence was over. "Come with me," she said softly. The boy looked up, confused. Her voice carried a gravity he wasn't used to hearing. Normally she asked things. Tonight she commanded. He hesitated, then followed. She led him past the kitchen, past the narrow hallway, to the small wooden staircase that led to the attic. He frowned. He had lived in this apartment for years and had never once seen her climb those steps. At the top she paused. Her hand lingered on the old brass handle as if it were a doorway to another life. Then she pushed it open. The attic was dim and smelled of cedar, dust, and something faintly sweet, like varnish lingering from decades past. A single hanging bulb dangled from the ceiling. She pulled the cord and light spilled across the room, revealing what looked like a hidden world. Wooden planks stacked neatly against one wall. Boxes labeled in a language he had seen only in scraps of letters from relatives overseas. A worn leather apron hung from a nail, its pockets heavy with small chisels, files, and blades that gleamed even under layers of dust. And on a low workbench in the corner, unfinished violin bodies, their delicate curves frozen mid-birth, as if time itself had abandoned them. The boy's breath caught. "Mom, what is this?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead she walked forward, her fingers brushing over the tools like one greeting old friends. Her touch was reverent, tender, filled with a familiarity that startled him. "I used to make them," she whispered at last, her voice trembling but proud. "Violins, cellos, instruments people would play in great halls, in symphonies you've only ever seen in books. This was my life before you." The boy blinked. The words felt unreal, like a story pulled from a dream. His mother, the waitress who carried trays of food to ungrateful customers, who returned home exhausted and smelling of fryer grease. How could she belong to this secret, noble world? She opened a small wooden chest and pulled out faded photographs. She handed them to him one by one. A younger version of herself standing beside a man in a workshop filled with violins. Another, her hands holding up an instrument freshly varnished, the wood glowing like honey. Another still, her standing proudly before a conservatory, the caption written in looping script. "Apprentice luthier, class of '95. He stared, his mouth dry. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Her eyes lowered. "Because dreams can be dangerous when the world tells you that you don't belong. I wanted you to build your own dream without the weight of mine pressing on your shoulders. But, all this time," his voice cracked, "you knew what it meant to me. And you stayed quiet." Tears gathered in her eyes. She reached for him, but he pulled back. "I wanted to tell you. So many times. But I thought, if I worked hard enough, if I sacrificed enough, you wouldn't need to know the things I had lost. You would only see possibility." The boy looked back at the broken violin case still clutched in his arms. Anger, confusion, awe, they collided inside him, leaving him trembling. "That's why you always looked at my violin the way you did," he whispered. "Like you recognized it. Like it wasn't just wood and strings." She nodded, her lips pressed tight. For a moment, silence filled the attic, broken only by the hum of the bulb. Then she walked to the bench, picked up one of the chisels and turned it in her hand. Her posture shifted. Gone was the weary waitress. Before him stood a woman transformed, her shoulders straight, her hands steady, her eyes alive with memory. "I can make you another," she said. The boy's eyes widened. "It will take nights, weeks maybe, but I will do it. Not because I want to give you what you lost, but because it's time you know who I am. And it's time I show you what it means to fight back. Not with fists, not with anger, but with creation." His throat tightened. "But, the competition is in days. There's no time." Her gaze held his, unshaken. "Maybe not for a new violin. But for a start. For something that will grow from our hands together. They can smash wood, but they cannot smash what we carry inside." that is stronger than anything they will ever hold. Something inside him cracked open, not the way his violin had, but in a way that let light flood in. For the first time he saw her not as a figure bent by labor, but as a giant who had chosen to kneel so he could stand taller. He set the broken violin aside and reached for the unfinished body on the bench. His hands trembled as he touched it, tracing the smooth wood, the delicate curves. "Teach me," he said. Her lips curved into a small, proud smile. She placed the chisel in his hand, guiding his fingers, showing him the balance, the pressure. Together they bent over the workbench, mother and son, two histories colliding into one present moment. The hours slipped by unnoticed. Midnight came and went, the city below drifting into silence. Dust motes danced in the lamplight as wood shavings curled from their hands, falling like soft snow to the floor. For every stroke she explained not just the technique but the philosophy, how a violin was not built but breathed into being, how each piece of wood carried its own voice waiting to be unlocked. The boy listened with a hunger he had never felt in the classroom, not even during music lessons. Here in this attic truth was alive. At one point he paused, staring at her in awe. "You gave all this up for me?" She met his gaze, her eyes shining. "I didn't give it up. I carried it with me, waiting for the moment you would need it." And with those words, the silence that had lived between them for years finally shattered. By dawn the attic floor was covered in wood shavings. The broken violin still lay in its case, but beside it stood something new, not finished, not yet playable, but alive in its beginning. A promise of what could be. The boy touched it, reverent. He no longer saw just wood. He saw resilience, memory, and legacy carved into its frame. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder. "Now you know, my son. Now you know who you are." And in that attic, beneath the rising sun, the boy's devastation transformed into something fierce and unbreakable. He had lost a violin, but he had gained the truth. And with it he had found the fire to play louder than any rival ever could. The attic smelled of time itself. Dust, resin, faint traces of cedar wood long asleep. The boy stood still as his mother struck a match and lit the old oil lamp, its glow painting their faces gold and shadow. The cracked beams overhead seemed to lean down, listening as if they too remembered the sounds once born here. On the workbench lay a collection of tools he had never seen. Chisels worn smooth by calloused hands, tiny planes sharp as whispers, clamps and strings coiled neatly as though waiting decades for this single night. She lifted them with reverence as though touching old friends. "This," she whispered, her finger running along the grain of an untouched maple plank, "is not just wood. It breathes. It listens. And if you listen closely, it sings back." The boy blinked, still struggling to process what he was seeing. He had always known her as a waitress, aprons smudged with grease, shoulders bent under trays heavy with other people's meals. Never this. Never the woman who stood now, shoulders straight, eyes alive, hands steady as she unwrapped forgotten instruments of her craft. You know how to do this?" His voice cracked. Her gaze lifted to meet his, steady as stone. "This was my life before I gave you mine." The words struck him like thunder. She laid the wood on the bench, feeling its surface with her palm. Every violin begins as a tree that stood tall against storms. That resilience lives inside it. And when shaped by patient hands, it tells stories no voice can carry. "Tonight we carve a voice for you." The boy's throat tightened. "But it's impossible. A violin takes months, sometimes years. How can—" She silenced him with a look. Not harsh but burning with quiet certainty. "When a mother builds for her child, time bends." And with that the work began. The first cut was soft like a secret. She pressed the chisel into the wood, shavings curling to the floor like golden ribbons. Each stroke had rhythm, a music of its own. The boy watched, breathless, as sawdust danced in the lamplight, a snowfall of creation. He tried to speak, to ask questions, but her focus was absolute. Sweat gathered on her brow, but her movements never faltered. The attic became a cathedral. Every scrape of blade, every strike of mallet, a hymn. "Do you hear it?" she asked suddenly, pausing to hold the half-shaped wood against her ear. "Hear what?" "The heartbeat." She handed it to him. "Close your eyes." He obeyed, pressing the curve of the forming body against his face. At first nothing. Just silence and the faint warmth of the wood. But then, A vibration faint but undeniable, as though the plank carried echoes of storms, roots, and centuries. He opened his eyes wide. You can hear it? She smiled. Every piece of wood has a voice just like people. Some are loud, some soft. Some broken but still beautiful. My job is not to force it but to set it free. The boy stared at her hands, strong, scarred, precise. He remembered those same hands bringing plates to tables, scrubbing stains from uniforms, rubbing her temples late at night. He had never known the truth. Those hands were not weary from labor. They were forged for creation. Hours passed. Midnight became one. One became two. The attic glowed brighter as though the work itself gave off light. He dozed and woke only to see her still at it, never slowing. When his head sank against a beam, she touched his hair gently. Stay awake, my son. This night belongs to us. He rubbed his eyes, fighting exhaustion. Why didn't you ever tell me? Her chisel paused. She inhaled, exhaled. Because I wanted you to build your own dreams, not inherit mine. You needed freedom. And freedom sometimes grows only when the soil of sacrifice hides beneath it. He swallowed hard. I was ashamed of you. At school. At the academy. When they said things about you being a waitress. She turned to him, her expression soft but sharp as flame. Shame is a seed planted by those who fear your roots. Never water it. Do you understand? His eyes filled. He nodded. The violin began to take form, curves rising like breath, a body emerging from wood that hours ago had been silent. She worked with fury and grace, fingers dancing faster than his eyes could follow. The boy leaned closer, realizing each movement was not random but part of a map etched in her memory, as if her very veins carried the blueprint of music. When the clock struck 3, she began varnishing. The attic filled with a rich, sweet aroma, amber, pine, something timeless. She brushed it gently, each stroke painting not just color but dignity, layering history over fresh birth. He touched the rim of the table, whispering, "It's beautiful. It's alive," she corrected. "And tomorrow it will sing for you." For the first time he reached for her hand. She let him hold it, their fingers brushing resin, dust, sweat, and tears together. He whispered, "I don't deserve this. You don't deserve it because you are my son. You deserve it because you never gave up. And that, my boy, is why I never gave up on you." The lamp flickered. Dawn crept slowly into the edges of the attic window, painting pale gold across the violin's surface. She lifted it, cradling it as though handing him a newborn child. "Remember," she said, her voice almost breaking, "every time you play not just for yourself. You play for every sacrifice, every silence, every unseen hand that built the road beneath your feet." He nodded, tears blurring his vision. The world outside had not yet awakened, but inside that attic, a resurrection had occurred. And as he touched the strings for the first time, the faintest note trembled through the room, raw, imperfect, but full of promise. His mother closed her eyes. For a moment she was not a waitress, not an immigrant, not a shadow in society's blind corner. She was who she truly was. A master, a builder of voices, a keeper of legacy. And in that sacred silence, the boy realized something had shifted forever. Because the world thought it had silenced him with splintered wood and arrogance. But what the world didn't know was that his voice was being rebuilt in the quiet fire of a mother's love. And that voice, once freed, would be unstoppable. The boy had fallen asleep by dawn, his head pressed against a beam, the faint hum of unfinished strings echoing in the attic. His mother sat in silence, staring at the violin glowing faintly under the soft spill of light. For the first time in years, memories she had locked away pressed against her chest, demanding release. Her hand trembled as she touched the instrument. And in that moment she was no longer in this dusty attic. She was back in her homeland. The air smelled of resin and varnish. Not attic dust, but the sweet fragrance of fresh maple shavings that clung to her workshop walls like perfume. She was young then, her hair tied back in a knot, her hands unscarred but already calloused from endless shaping, sanding, and polishing. The workshop had been alive with music, not just from instruments finished and strung, but from the very process itself. The ring of chisels, the scrape of blades, the sigh of sawdust falling to the floor. To her, every stroke was a conversation with wood, every curve an intimate secret. She had been known, whispered about in cities and orchestras, the girl with the hands of fire. Critics said her violins did not just sing, they wept, they prayed, they danced. Her instruments found their way into the hands of concertmasters and soloists. Her name passed between lips with reverence. Her fame was not built on wealth or family or connections. It was carved into maple and spruce, varnished in amber, strung with steel and gut. She had nothing, and yet with her chisels and patience she gave the world voices of eternity. But as her violins rose in prominence, so too did the storm in her country. The streets she once walked freely filled with soldiers in uniforms that grew darker with each passing season. Banners replaced blossoms and silence replaced laughter. She remembered the nights she worked by candlelight pretending not to hear the sounds outside. The shouts, the gunfire, the sudden silences that followed. One evening, as she was fitting the bridge to a violin destined for the National Orchestra, there was a knock. Not polite, not hesitant, the knock of authority. When she opened the door, men stood there, demanding her loyalty not as a luthier but as a tool for propaganda. "Your violins will be symbols," they said. "When our leader speaks, the music you create will stand beside him. You will craft the sound of the new nation." She bowed her head, but her heart burned. For how could an instrument built for truth and beauty become a servant of lies? She refused. Quietly but firmly. And that refusal cost her everything. Over the following months, contracts dissolved. Orchestras that once sought her instruments avoided her. Friends looked away when she passed in the marketplace. The walls of her workshop became prison bars, not by iron but by silence. One night the workshop door was smashed. Her tools scattered. Violins in progress were split in half, their voices murdered before they could be born. She stood there in the wreckage, tears dripping onto splintered wood, knowing she could no longer stay. It was then she made her choice. She gathered what little she could carry, not her fame, not her reputation, not even her finest instruments. Only her son, still a child with wide eyes and soft hands. He clung to her skirts, asking why they were leaving. She could not answer. On the night they fled, she looked back one final time at the workshop. The shadows of broken violins lay across the floor, glinting under moonlight like fallen soldiers. Her chest tightened. That room had been her cathedral, her battlefield, her sanctuary. Now it was only a grave. She whispered a vow as she left. "I will give you silence now, but one day I will give you music again." Exile was not romantic. It was humiliation draped in survival. She scrubbed dishes, waited tables, cleaned halls where music played but not for her. Sometimes she heard the faint echo of a violin in a restaurant speaker or passing car, and it felt like a knife twisting between her ribs. The world had not stopped singing, but it no longer wanted her voice. Her son grew unaware of the truth. She never told him of her past. She let him see her only as a servant of necessity, not as a creator of beauty. For what use was glory if it starved her child? She watched him chase music in secret, scraping coins together to join the academy, running between lessons and home, practicing late into the night. She never stopped him even when the tuition cost her sleep and meals. He thought she knew nothing of violins, nothing of the stage. She let him think that. Because it was safer for him to rise on his own merit than to be shadowed by the ghosts of her fall. Now in the attic she stared at the violin they had built together overnight. Her son stirred, his eyelids fluttering, unaware of the flood she was reliving. She touched the curve of the instrument gently, like the cheek of a child. A whisper escaped her lips. "You were not born into poverty, my son. You were born into music. And I buried it so that you could bloom free from its curse." Her eyes brimmed. She remembered the offers she had turned down, the fame she abandoned, the voice she silenced. She had once stood on the edge of immortality, her name ready to be carved into history. But she had stepped back. Not because she was weak, but because she chose him. The boy stirred awake, catching the trace of her whisper. His voice groggy asked, "What did you say?" She froze. Should she tell him? Should she open the vault she had sealed for so long? Her hand trembled over the violin's surface. Her past pressed against her throat, begging to be spoken. She looked into his tired eyes, the same eyes that once followed her through crowded refugee stations, the same eyes that searched her face for answers when she carried him into a foreign land with nothing but desperation in her arms. "Mother," he pressed softly. She opened her mouth and the words trembled on the edge of air. I was once. Her breath caught. She swallowed, her heart pounding with 20 years of silence. I was once someone the world wanted to remember. His brow furrowed, confused. But I chose to let them forget. And with that she fell silent again. The boy sat upright, stunned, trying to form words. But before he could, she stood, wiping her eyes, her face hardening into calm resolve. Enough. The violin is ready. And so are you. She turned away, hiding the storm still raging in her chest. Because the full truth, the depth of what she abandoned, the magnitude of her sacrifice, was not ready to be told. Not yet. That revelation would wait for the moment when the music itself demanded it. And that moment was coming. The hall was a cathedral of expectation, every breath drawn in suspense, every glance turned toward the trembling boy who walked under the unforgiving stage lights. His shoes scuffed faintly against polished wood as though even the floor was reluctant to accept his presence. In his hands the violin gleamed, not store-bought, not handed down by privilege but born of firelight, memory and sacrifice. The rival in the front row leaned back with a smug grin, certain that humiliation was only moments away. The audience whispered, their murmurs weaving into a low tide of skepticism. A waitress's son, an outsider, daring to stand on this stage with nothing but patched-up pride? How naive. The boy's fingers tightened around the neck of the violin, its varnish warm against his palm, its weight both terrifying and comforting. He remembered the midnight workshop, his mother's hands shaping wood like a sculptor shaping destiny. He remembered her words, every piece of wood has a voice just like every person. Now standing here, his body quaked with the fear that he might fail not only himself but her too. The announcer's voice cut through the tension, crisp and ceremonial. Next performer, representing the Academy's scholarship program. A pause, subtle but sharp, as if the title itself carried unspoken judgment. Daniel Reyes. He raised the bow but his arm trembled. The rival smirked wider. A few teachers leaned in, some curious, others braced for disaster. The boy could hear every whispered insult that had haunted him. Charity case, waitress's son, not one of us. His throat tightened. For a moment he considered running. But then his mother's face flickered in his memory. Tired, yes, but resolute, luminous in the glow of the workshop lamp. Her eyes had not pleaded, they had trusted. He took a deep breath. And then he played. The first note cut through the hall like a lightning strike, fierce, crystalline, alive. The air shifted, the whispers died mid-sentence and silence deepened into reverence. The boy's bow danced across the strings, coaxing a sound that was more than music. It was thunder rolling across mountains, silk whispering over stone, fire cracking in the hearth of a forgotten home. It was the memory of exile, of sacrifice, of a mother bending her back so her child might rise straighter. The rival's smirk faltered. His eyes darted to the violin, then to the mother in the shadows at the back of the hall. She sat quietly, her apron still folded under her coat, her hands clasped in front of her mouth as if praying, not for success but for the recognition of truth. The boy lost himself in the sound. Every bow stroke was a confession. The shame he had felt for his mother's job, the envy of classmates' wealth, the loneliness of carrying immigrant struggles in an elite world. And in each rising crescendo he buried those wounds beneath something greater. Love, resilience, dignity. The violin spoke not only for him but for her, for every parent whose story was dismissed in whispers, for every child caught between two worlds. The judges leaned forward. One of them, a stern man known for his impossible standards, blinked rapidly as if trying to disguise the moisture gathering in his eyes. Another clasped her hands against her chest, visibly moved. By the second movement the hall was transformed. The rival shifted uneasily in his seat, realizing that this wasn't a performance. It was an eruption of truth. He had smashed a violin thinking he had silenced a boy. Instead he had unleashed a legacy he could never match. The final passage arrived like a storm. Daniel's bow attacked the strings with a precision that was not born of privilege, but of hunger, of nights spent practicing while others slept, of a mother's sacrifices turned into sound. Each note seemed to pierce the air with fire, demanding not admiration but recognition. And then the last note hung suspended, a thin thread of silver vibrating through silence so deep it felt holy. Daniel lowered the bow. His chest heaved. His hands shook not from fear now but from the enormity of what had just passed through him. The hall erupted. Applause crashed like waves, unstoppable, uncontainable. People leapt to their feet, clapping until their palms stung, cheering as though trying to outmatch the power of what they had just heard. It was not polite appreciation. It was a standing ovation born of shock, awe, and surrender. Daniel's eyes darted to the back of the hall. His mother stood there, still quiet, still humble. But her face glowed with something he had never seen before, a pride unhidden, a truth unveiled. For the first time he did not see her as a waitress. He saw her as the master builder, the artist, the woman who had built this moment with her own hands. The rival shrank in his seat, red-faced and defeated. Teachers who had doubted the boy now whispered in admiration, some ashamed, others stunned. The applause thundered on, and in that storm of sound, Daniel felt something inside him shift. Shame melted into pride, fear into belonging. He bowed. The lights bathed him in gold. The violin gleamed as though alive. And in that instant it was no longer just his performance. It was their performance. His mother's, his own, and every invisible immigrant who had ever carried worlds on their shoulders. But as the ovation roared, as the hall became a stage of vindication, a shadow lingered in Daniel's mind. This wasn't just a performance. It was the beginning of something larger. The world had just seen him and through him seen her. The question now was, what would they do with that revelation? The rival clenched his fists, his jaw tight. He had been humiliated, but humiliation often festers into vengeance. And though Daniel stood victorious in this moment, the storm outside the hall was only just beginning. And so, as the applause echoed into eternity, one truth remained. The final performance was not the end. It was the opening of a new battle neither he nor his mother had anticipated. The ovation from Daniel's performance still thundered in the rafters long after he left the stage. The rival, Alexander, sat frozen, his fists pressed against his knees, his jaw clenched so hard the veins along his temple pulsed. A boy he had mocked, humiliated, even sabotaged had just stolen the entire hall. And not just stolen, it was as if Daniel had rewritten the rules of what music could be. When the applause finally ebbed and the judges called for the next performer, the spell began to lift. But it left behind a silence that clung to Alexander like a shadow. For the first time in his life he wasn't the one being admired. He wasn't the prodigy whispered about in hallways, the shining heir of privilege. He was just another student sitting in the audience and worse, mocked by the same peers who once clung to his every word. The first whisper came from the row behind him. "Did you see his face when Daniel played?" Followed by stifled laughter. Another voice, "All that money, all those teachers, and still he couldn't come close." The words pierced sharper than any violin string snapping. Alexander shifted in his seat, his face burning red, his palms clammy. He tried to straighten his back to wear arrogance like armor, but it sagged under the weight of truth. His father, seated further back in the hall, looked on with narrowed eyes. A businessman who had poured fortunes into his son's training, Alexander's father was not clapping, not smiling, not even pretending. His stare was cold and sharp as a blade, a silent reprimand that cut deeper than words ever could. His mother, glittering with jewelry in the reserved section, fanned herself anxiously, unwilling to meet the gaze of other parents who leaned together, whispering. For years, Alexander had believed money made him untouchable. Private tutors, world-class instruments, the best schools. He had mocked Daniel's thrift store shoes, sneered at the patched-up case his violin once lived in. And yet, tonight, none of those advantages could shield him. In fact, they only amplified the humiliation. Because what excuse could there be? He had everything, and still he was defeated by someone who had nothing but his mother's hands and his own stubborn heart. At intermission, the courtyard buzzed with voices. Clusters of students gathered in little circles, talking animatedly. Alexander tried to stride past them, chin high, but he couldn't ignore the words. "That sound, did you hear it? Like the violin was alive." Daniel's performance was real. Not rehearsed perfection, but something else. Alexander can't even fake that kind of soul. He plays like a robot. The laughter that followed was dagger-sharp. For years, Alexander had been the one laughing at others, dismissing them as amateurs. Now the circle had turned and his own mockery had come back doubled. He ducked into the restroom, locking himself in a stall. His chest heaved, his reflection in the metal door warped and ugly. His hands trembled, not with fear but with rage. He pressed them against his thighs until crescents of nails dug into skin. It's not fair, he thought. I'm the one who's worked for this. I'm the one who deserves it. But the truth gnawed at him. He hadn't worked, not the way Daniel had. He had relied on tutors to fix his mistakes, on expensive instruments to mask his lack of feeling, on his family's influence to secure places in competitions. He had treated music as a trophy, a way to assert superiority, not as the voice of something human. Daniel's sound had exposed all of that. When he emerged, two classmates he had once ridiculed smirked as he passed. One of them muttered loud enough for him to hear, "Guess money can't buy soul." The other chuckled, "Or respect." The words echoed. For the first time in his life, Alexander felt powerless. His arrogance had always been a fortress, but tonight it was rubble. Later, when he returned to the hall for the results, the contrast was unbearable. Daniel's name was announced among the finalists, his applause booming with genuine admiration. When Alexander's name was skipped, the silence was louder than any cheer. A few polite claps fluttered, but they weren't for him. They were pity, scraps thrown at a fallen heir. He looked to his parents. His mother's lips were pressed tight, her jewels suddenly gaudy, cheap against the shame on her face. His father's eyes were stone, his jaw set in silent fury. For a moment, Alexander wished he could vanish, swallowed whole by the ground beneath him. And then, as if to twist the knife, Daniel turned, violin still in hand, and glanced toward him. Not smug, not mocking, but calm, almost pitying. That look was worse than laughter. It was acknowledgement of the truth. Alexander had been defeated not by luck, not by sabotage, but by something he could never fake. True art had triumphed over empty arrogance. When the night ended, Alexander left the hall with his parents, the murmurs of others following him like a trail of ash. He tried to lift his chin, but every laugh, every whisper pressed it lower. His father's silence was crushing, his mother's hand on his arm cold and perfunctory. As they stepped into the night, Alexander's collapse was complete. Not in fire, not in scandal, but in the quiet way people stopped respecting him. His name, once spoken with awe, was now uttered as a cautionary tale. A boy who had everything but no soul. A prince dethroned by a pauper who carried true music in his veins. And deep inside, beneath the rage and humiliation, Alexander knew this wound was not temporary. Money could buy him another violin, another stage, another audience. But it could never buy back the dignity he had lost tonight. The final note still hung in the air, trembling like a bird that refused to land. For a heartbeat, the world was utterly silent. No coughs, no shuffling of feet, not even the sound of someone breathing. Daniel lowered the bow, his hand quivering as if it too had absorbed the electricity of the performance. And then, like the crack of a match in a dark room, the hall erupted. The audience leapt to their feet as one. Applause thundered through the rafters, a tidal wave of sound that crashed against the stage. Palms beat together so hard they stung. Cheers erupted, rising higher and higher until the hall no longer resembled a concert venue but something closer to a stadium. Daniel. 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 The chant began softly, a ripple in the front rows, then spread like wildfire through the hall. Within moments, hundreds of voices echoed his name, a living rhythm that rose above the applause. It was not polite recognition, not the restrained approval of critics, but raw, unfiltered admiration. Cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters in the aisles leaned forward, their shutters clicking rapidly, desperate to capture this boy who had transformed into something more than a competitor. Their lenses caught his wide, stunned eyes, the sheen of sweat along his brow, the way he clutched the violin, his mother's violin, like it was not an instrument but a lifeline. Daniel's throat tightened. He had dreamt of applause before in restless nights and fleeting daydreams. But nothing in those fantasies compared to this storm of sound, this overwhelming roar that seemed to lift him off his feet. His legs trembled. His fingers, still curled around the bow, ached from the intensity of what he had just given. For a flicker of a second, doubt surged. Was this really for me? For the boy they mocked, the boy who tripped over his own bowstring at practice, the boy who was told he didn't belong here? But the chant answered him. His name rang out again, and with each repetition the doubt cracked and crumbled. This was real. This was his. On the far side of the hall, his rivals sat stunned. Alexander's pale face burned under the stage lights, his fists clenched uselessly in his lap. But Daniel hardly noticed. The hall had shifted its gaze. The crowd was no longer whispering about the wealthy prodigy with famous parents. They were shouting the name of a boy no one had bet on, the boy who rose from shadows to set the stage aflame. Daniel's eyes swept the hall, searching for the only face that mattered. His vision blurred under the flashes, under the sheer brilliance of light bouncing from every angle. And then, there. In the back row where the seats were cheapest, where the spotlights barely reached, his mother. She wasn't clapping wildly like the rest. She wasn't on her feet chanting. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her posture humble and still. Yet her eyes, oh her eyes, shone brighter than all the cameras combined. Pride radiated from her in silence, like a lighthouse glowing steadily while storms raged around it. For a moment, Daniel's chest ached. The hall could scream his name until the roof shook, but he knew the truth. Every note he played tonight carried her fingerprints. Every vibration of the strings carried the years of sacrifice she had buried quietly, the past she had revealed in whispers, the nights she gave up sleep so he could dream. He raised the violin slightly, not as a trophy but as a wordless gesture, a bow not to the judges or the cameras but to her. Their eyes met across the cavernous hall, across the wealth and power and arrogance that had always tried to drown them, and in that glance everything was spoken. This is yours too. His mother's lips curved into the faintest smile. He did not wave, did not draw attention. She remained still as though she belonged in the shadows, content to let her son stand in the light. But Daniel knew, everyone cheering his name was unknowingly also cheering hers. The chant rose louder. Daniel. Daniel. Students pounded the backs of chairs in rhythm. Some parents wiped their eyes, moved not only by the music but by the transformation they had witnessed. An underdog becoming a giant before their eyes. The judges, usually composed, leaned toward one another in hushed conversation, their faces struggling to hide astonishment. Even the stoic head judge tapped his fingers against his lap in unconscious rhythm, a gesture that betrayed how deeply the performance had reached him. Daniel bowed, clumsy at first, then deeper, his hair falling into his face. The applause refused to stop. It built higher still, refusing to die down, as if the crowd had more to give than he could possibly receive. His name became the hall's heartbeat. And in the middle of it he thought of his journey, the ridicule, the violin smashed at his lowest moment, the night of sawdust and firelight in the attic, his mother's trembling hands guiding him, her voice whispering that every piece of wood had a voice. Now in this moment he finally understood. The violin was not just wood and string. It was her voice. His voice. Their story. The cameras captured him standing tall, bow at his side, violin gleaming under the hot lights. They would splash his face across newspapers, plaster it on social feeds, call him a prodigy, a miracle, a phoenix rising. But none of those words mattered. What mattered was that somewhere in the quiet back row, his mother sat with tears sliding silently down her cheeks, unseen by most but not by him. The ovation stretched on endless, as though the hall refused to release him. And for the first time, Daniel didn't shrink under the attention. He embraced it not for his ego, not for revenge against rivals, but because it meant the world was finally hearing what his mother had taught him. That true music was born not of arrogance but of love, sacrifice and truth. He raised the violin once more as if letting the crowd drink in the sight, and then lowered it gently, holding it to his chest like a heartbeat. The chant swelled again, echoing against the rafters, rattling the air with one name alone. Daniel. And though the boy on stage trembled with awe, it was the quiet woman in the shadows who carried the greatest victory. The standing ovation did not end inside the hall. It spilled out, multiplied and scattered like sparks carried by the wind. By the time Daniel and his mother stepped out into the night, the world had already begun to roar. It started small. An audience member in the second row had recorded the final minute of Daniel's performance on her phone. She had uploaded it in haste, hands trembling, captioning it simply, "I have no words. This boy just redefined music. #Violin of Sacrifice." Within 20 minutes, the clip had crossed 100,000 views. By dawn it had exploded past 5 million. The hashtag spread like wildfire. #Violin of Sacrifice trended first, capturing the haunting beauty of the story woven into every note. Then came #Honor the Mothers, sparked by a journalist who noted, "Behind every genius is often a quiet sacrifice." Tonight we saw not just a prodigy, but the legacy of a mother who gave everything. Others added their own. #Strings of Truth, #Music Beyond Wealth, and more poignantly #From Shadows to Stage. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Each platform became a stage of its own. Clips of Daniel's trembling hands steadying as the music swelled were played side by side with footage of the stunned rival, his lips pressed into a thin, pale line. The internet had already chosen its narrative. True art versus arrogance, love versus entitlement. Commentators flood in. The first to weigh in were the music critics. A respected columnist wrote at midnight, "I have attended performances across Vienna, Paris, and New York, but I have rarely seen an audience move to tears en masse. This boy's violin did not just sing. It bled, it healed, it resurrected." He played as if centuries of longing had been compressed into a single night. Soon academics chimed in, dissecting the cultural weight of what had happened. One university professor wrote, "It is not enough to say the performance was beautiful. What we witnessed was intergenerational sacrifice distilled into sound. His mother built more than an instrument, she built a future, and tonight we saw that future ignite." Memes and emotional posts. Not all reactions were formal. Memes surfaced within hours. One viral image split the screen. On the left, Alexander sitting rigid, jaw clenched, the caption, "Money can buy lessons." On the right, Daniel mid-bow, sweat and fire in his eyes, "But it cannot buy soul." Another viral TikTok set footage of Daniel's final bow to a slow-motion montage, the crowd chanting his name while the text overlaid read, "He didn't just play for himself. He played for the woman in the back row." Tens of thousands of comments flooded in. "I'm sobbing. Protect this boy at all costs. Where is his mother? We need to honor her. I showed this to my mom. We both cried. This is why art matters. This is why stories matter." Journalistic pursuit of the mother. By the next morning, reporters were no longer just writing about Daniel. They were chasing the identity of his mother. Who is she? Where had she come from? Why had no one heard of her before? Someone posted a grainy zoomed-in photo of her sitting in the back row, her expression calm amidst chaos. It went viral instantly, not because it was glamorous but because it was so ordinary. A woman in plain clothes, her hands folded, watching her son. No makeup, no spotlight, just presence. Caption read, "She carried an orchestra in her silence." And the internet agreed. Hashtags honoring mothers, single parents, and immigrants surged. People began sharing their own family sacrifices under the banner of #Honor the Mothers. One tweet with 1 million likes said, "My mom worked 3 jobs so I could go to medical school. Watching this boy's performance made me realize, we are all playing instruments our mothers built for us." Daniel becomes a symbol. Television anchors called him the boy who reminded the world of humility. Music schools referenced his performance as proof that greatness comes from authenticity, not pedigree. And social media elevated him into a living symbol. Daniel was no longer just a competitor, he was the embodiment of something bigger. He represented every underdog who had been dismissed. He represented every parent whose sacrifice went unseen. He represented every dream built in silence, waiting for its moment to sing. The rivals collapse online. While Daniel soared, Alexander crumbled. Clips of him sneering before the performance resurfaced, played against footage of him sitting pale-faced afterward. His old interviews where he mocked amateurs were reposted with brutal captions. A particularly viral TikTok spliced together. Alexander bragging, "Competition is meaningless when you're destined for greatness." Daniel's violin screaming with beauty. The crowd chanting, "Daniel." Caption, "Destiny doesn't bow to arrogance." Even Alexander's sponsors began to distance themselves. His Instagram, once filled with expensive suits and champagne glasses, became a battleground of angry comments. Some taunted, some pitted, but all agreed. The stage had revealed the truth. Documentaries and think pieces. Within days, short documentaries popped up on YouTube. The Violin That Shook the World. Others bore titles like The Mother in the Shadows, or When Art Defied Privilege. Think pieces circulated, arguing that Daniel's performance symbolized the clash between old wealth and new authenticity. Political commentators even latched onto it, claiming the story mirrored social struggles beyond music, the voiceless finally being heard. Some critics warned against romanticizing too much, but their voices drowned in the tide. The narrative was too powerful. Daniel and his mother watching it all. Daniel, however, wasn't watching the chaos unfold in real time. After the performance, he had gone home exhausted, Violin still clutched in his arms. His mother brewed him tea the way she always had, and they sat in silence. When he woke the next morning, his phone was nearly unusable. Millions of notifications, endless calls, requests for interviews, invitations from orchestras around the globe. He scrolled, stunned, seeing his own face splashed across every platform. But what caught his breath was not the praise of critics or the trending memes. It was the pictures of his mother. That single grainy image of her in the back row had reached millions. People had crowned her the silent architect, the mother of sacrifice, the true composer behind the music. Daniel turned the phone to her, his eyes wide. They know, Mama. They know it was you. She shook her head softly, a faint smile crossing her lips. No, Daniel. They only know because you made them listen. Global reach. News outlets in Europe, Asia, Africa all carried the story. A Brazilian journalist wrote. His bow struck not just strings but hearts across continents. An Indian conductor tweeted, I would travel oceans to shake the hand of the mother who carved not just wood but destiny. In refugee communities across the world, the story struck like lightning. Families who had lost everything saw themselves reflected in Daniel's mother, who had carried her craft quietly into exile. And so the hashtags deepened. #exile to exaltation, #songs of the mothers. A movement is born. What began as applause in a concert hall became something larger. A movement. Music schools launched scholarships in honor of parents who sacrificed for their children. Fundraisers for immigrant families spread with the tagline, Every dream deserves strings. Even in classrooms, teachers showed Daniel's performance as an example of perseverance, asking students, whose sacrifices built your future? And for mothers everywhere, the hashtags became a rallying cry. Social feeds filled with portraits, stories, confessions of invisible labor finally honored in public. One viral video showed a mother fixing her son's tie before school. Over it the caption read, Not all violins are carved from wood. Some are carved from love. But in the middle of this storm, as cameras knocked on their door and offers flooded in, Daniel's mother grew quiet. She avoided interviews, turned away the microphones. Fame was dangerous, she knew this from her past. Too much light could burn. And one night, as Daniel scrolled through endless praise, she placed a hand gently over his phone. Her eyes were steady, carrying something heavier than pride. Remember, Daniel, she whispered, applause is loud but it fades. What matters is whether the music still lives when the world goes silent. Daniel nodded, but deep inside he felt a question rising. A question the internet hadn't asked yet but would. What exactly had his mother left behind in her homeland? What was she running from? The world saw her as a saint in the shadows. But Daniel knew there was more. A story untold, a wound unhealed. And soon that truth would come crashing into the light. The academy had always been a fortress of prestige, a place where marble floors and polished chandeliers reflected more than light. They reflected power, money, and lineage. For years, the corridors echoed with names tied to dynasties, each student carrying not just a violin or a cello but the weight of generations of privilege. In that environment, an immigrant boy was supposed to be little more than a footnote, a reminder that exceptions existed but never defined the rule. Yet after that night, after the performance that silenced cynics and shook the very pillars of the institution, everything began to shift. First it was subtle. A few teachers, the ones who had quietly admired his grit from the beginning, now spoke louder in staff meetings. They reminded their colleagues of how talent does not wear a uniform, how genius can come wrapped in the hands of a waitress's son. One stern violin professor who had once muttered about standards being lowered, suddenly found herself unable to dismiss the raw, undeniable brilliance that had brought the hall to its feet. She replayed the boy's performance in her mind and realized her teaching philosophy was thinner than the strings she obsessed over. Students noticed too. The very peers who once whispered about his cheap shoes, or mocked the way his mother arrived in a diner uniform now glanced at him differently. They had seen the crowd rise for him, seen judges' eyes glisten as they struggled to hold back tears, seen the world online chant his name alongside hashtags that demanded dignity for all mothers. Envy turned into awe and ridicule into reluctant respect. Even the wealthy rival whose arrogance had once filled every hallway, now walked in silence, overshadowed by the boy he had tried so hard to crush. The administration could not ignore what had happened. Emails poured in from donors, alumni, even international media outlets, all demanding to know how such talent had been overlooked and nearly silenced. The Academy's pristine reputation, once untouchable, suddenly looked fragile. In board meetings, the words reputation management shifted into moral responsibility. For the first time, they questioned the systems that had long favored wealth over passion, bloodlines over effort. And so, change was forced into motion. New policies emerged, ones that had once been unthinkable. A scholarship fund was announced, not for the already privileged but for those who carried the invisible burdens of immigrant families, single parents and underprivileged backgrounds. Teachers were tasked with identifying raw, overlooked talent, not just grooming the polished resumes of the elite. Suddenly, the Academy's walls seemed a little less like a fortress and a little more like a bridge. But the transformation wasn't only structural, it was cultural. Students began to talk differently, some for the first time asking about each other's families, not to rank their wealth but to understand their struggles. The cafeteria that once divided the children of CEOs from the children of laborers became a place where stories flowed. One student from a privileged background confessed he had never realized how much shame someone could carry just from watching their parents serve tables. Another admitted he had taken his family's resources for granted, but now, after witnessing the boy's triumph, he felt the weight of responsibility to use his privilege differently. Through it all, the boy remained unchanged. He still practiced late into the night, his mother's violin pressed against his chin like a sacred relic. He still walked home to a modest apartment, still carried the quiet humility that had defined him long before the applause. And yet, without meaning to, he had become more than just a student. He had become a symbol. His story was whispered to younger students as a lesson, written into school publications as an example, and cited by teachers who wanted their colleagues to remember that greatness does not come with a price tag. In the quiet of her diner shifts, his mother overheard students and staff speaking of her son when they visited for late-night coffee or weekend meals. They didn't just talk about his performance, they spoke about her. About the hands that had carved history out of wood and silence. About the sacrifices that had built a stage for someone else to stand on. Though she never sought recognition, she became the invisible architect of a revolution in an academy that had once ignored people like her. The ripple effect extended beyond the campus. Other institutions watched closely. If a prestigious academy could transform its approach, what excuse did they have not to follow? Music schools across the country began re-evaluating their entry systems, questioning the weight of legacy over skill. For the first time, immigrant parents, once sitting quietly in the shadows of recitals, were invited to tell their stories, to be honored as co-authors of their children's success. But within the academy itself, the air felt different. No longer could a rich student dismiss an immigrant peer with a cruel glance. No longer could a teacher assume that pedigree equaled potential. Every note played in practice rooms now carried the echo of that one night. The night a waitress's son had shattered centuries of arrogance with the power of sound. Still, as the boy watched these changes unfold, he knew this was only the beginning. The academy was evolving, yes, but the world outside its gates still carried the same prejudices, the same divisions. What they had sparked here was a flame. The question was whether it would be allowed to spread, or whether the forces of arrogance would try once again to smother it before it lit the sky. The boy used to flinch every time he saw her walk through the door of the academy. Her shoes carried the smell of grease from the diner, her apron sometimes still faintly dusted with flour or coffee stains, her hair tucked back hastily after a double shift. He had loved her, of course. What son doesn't love the mother who works herself to the bone for him? But love and shame had been tangled in him like two strings pulled taut in opposite directions. He wished, secretly and cruelly, that she could have been like the other mothers. Perfumed, manicured, carrying handbags that cost more than their month's rent. He hated the smirks of his classmates, the pitying glances of teachers. He hated that her job announced their poverty before he ever touched a violin string. But after the performance, something inside him shifted. At first it was subtle. The shame he usually carried like a second skin didn't rise when he saw her standing at the back of the hall. Instead there was pride, a raw, swelling pride that almost startled him. The memory of her hands, steady and strong, guiding the chisel through wood under firelight, burned brighter than the memory of her carrying trays of coffee for strangers. In his eyes, she was no longer just the woman in the apron. She was the master luthier who had once built instruments that carried nations' songs. Walking through the academy the next day, he no longer hunched his shoulders when people whispered about him. For the first time, he didn't fear the whispers. Let them talk, he thought. Let them know who she really was. The boy realized he had been living under a mask, not hers but his own. He had hidden his roots, pretending to be embarrassed of her sacrifices, when in truth every note he played was carved out of the hours she had spent working, every phrase of music born from the exhaustion she endured so he could stand where he stood. One evening, as they sat at the small kitchen table in their cramped apartment, he reached across and took her hands. They were rough, scarred from years of labor both at the diner and in the woodshop of her past. He remembered how he used to hate those scars, wishing she had smooth, polished fingers like the other mothers he saw at recitals. But now he looked at them with awe. These were the hands that had built more than violins. They had built him. "Mom," he said softly, I used to wish you were different. That you didn't have to work at the diner. That you could be like them." He swallowed, ashamed of the confession but knowing it had to be spoken. "But now I see. You weren't serving tables. You were building something bigger. You were building me." Her eyes widened, shimmering with tears. She tried to blink away. For years she had carried the weight of his unspoken shame, feeling it in his silences, in the way he sometimes walked ahead of her when other students passed by. She never resented him for it. How could a child understand the value of sacrifice when sacrifice was invisible? But hearing him speak those words broke something open in her. He went on, his voice trembling but steadying as he spoke. "When you're in that diner, you're not just carrying plates. You're carrying us. Every hour you worked was a brick in the foundation you gave me. And when you built that violin, you didn't just give me an instrument. You gave me a legacy. I don't care if anyone laughs at your job anymore. Let them. They'll never know what it means to have a mother like you." That night something changed between them. For years, their love had been laced with unspoken tension. Her silence about her past, his quiet shame about her present. But now there was no veil. They sat together long after midnight. Not as a mother and son separated by sacrifice, but as two people bound by it. At the academy, his identity began to shine in ways it never had before. Where once he had tried to hide his background, now he leaned into it. When asked about his violin, he didn't say it was just old wood, as he once did. He said proudly, "My mother built it." When students asked about his family, he didn't mutter vague excuses. He told them she worked at a diner, that she raised him alone, that she carried more strength in her small frame than most men twice her size. To his surprise, people listened differently now. Instead of mocking him, they admired him. Instead of sneering at her job, they began to see it through his eyes, as a symbol of endurance, of dignity, of invisible heroism. A strange thing happened. His mother became a quiet legend among the students. Not because she was wealthy or powerful, but because she embodied something that money couldn't buy. He also noticed a shift within himself as a musician. Before, his playing had always carried an undercurrent of anger. Anger at being underestimated, at feeling small, at the shame of poverty clinging to him like dust. But now his music carried something different. When he played, it was as though he was telling the world, "This is who I am. This is where I come from. And I am not ashamed." His notes rang out fuller, richer, not fueled by resentment but by pride. Judges noticed it. Teachers noticed it. His rival noticed it too, and hated it because it was something that could not be faked or bought. One weekend he accompanied his mother to the diner. He had avoided the place for years, too embarrassed to be seen there. But now he walked beside her with his head high. The clinking of dishes, the hiss of frying pans, the tired laughter of other workers, it no longer felt like a mark of shame. It felt like home. When customers glanced at him curiously, he didn't shrink away. He sat in a corner booth, opened his violin case and practiced quietly, letting the sounds of Bach and Mozart drift through the air of a place usually filled with chatter and clatter. Patrons stopped to listen. Some clapped. His mother beamed, tears in her eyes as she poured coffee with a smile that seemed lighter than it had in years. In that moment he realized the truth. Dignity is not found in the job you have but in the way you carry it. His mother had carried every plate, every cup, every burden with quiet dignity, and now he could finally see it. She had never been a servant of tables. She had always been the builder of legacies. And for the first time in his life he wasn't just her son. He was her witness. The rival could not stand it any longer. Each headline that celebrated the boy's triumph felt like a dagger, each chant of the audience's voices replayed in his nightmares. He had been raised in a world where money always tilted the balance, where influence erased mistakes, and where humiliation was never supposed to touch him. Yet here he was, mocked by his peers, abandoned by his former admirers, drowning in the shadow of someone he once dismissed as a nobody. But arrogance does not die quietly. In the hollow silence of his disgrace, the rival hatched one final plan. If he could not outplay the boy, he would destroy him. And so, one morning, whispers began to spread like smoke through the academy. The boy had cheated. The violin, the rival claimed, was not his at all. He had fabricated the story of his mother's craftsmanship, stolen someone else's work, and wrapped it in a sentimental lie. "It's all theater," the rival sneered to anyone who would listen. "He's manipulating you. There's no way a diner waitress could build something of such quality. You're all being fooled." The accusation struck like a poisoned arrow. The academy, once so eager to hold up the boy as a symbol of resilience, could not ignore such claims. A formal investigation was opened. Teachers, administrators, even outside experts were summoned to examine the instrument, to trace its origins. For a brief, dreadful moment, doubt clouded the air. Could it be true? Could the story that had inspired so many have been a carefully staged deception? The boy felt the weight of suspicion pressing down on him like iron chains. For a heartbeat, fear flickered in his chest. Not fear of guilt, for he had none, but fear of losing what he and his mother had fought so hard to build. He saw the way some students looked at him now, their admiration cooled into wary curiosity. He heard the whispers in the hallways. It was as if the rival had thrown ink into clear water and now everything seemed stained. His mother, however, did not waver. When he returned home that night, exhausted and heavy with worry, she placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "Truth doesn't fear the light. Lies always collapse when you shine enough of it." Her words were not fiery or dramatic, but steady, spoken with the calm assurance of someone who had lived long enough to see falsehoods unravel on their own. The investigation pressed forward. Experts examined the violin with ruthless precision. They traced the wood, the varnish, the structure. What they found astonished even them. The instrument bore the unmistakable marks of her craftsmanship. Subtle techniques, unique choices in construction, signatures of style invisible to the untrained eye but undeniable to those who knew. Old workshop records surfaced, showing her apprenticeship, her time under a master luthier, her abandoned dreams before life's hardships dragged her into obscurity. Even former colleagues who remembered her youth came forward, voices filled with awe as they confirmed her forgotten reputation. When the evidence was presented, it was not just a vindication. It was a revelation. The rival's accusations crumbled like sand in a storm. What he had intended as the boy's undoing became instead the final, irrefutable proof of his story. The world now knew beyond doubt that the violin was not a forgery or a trick. It was a masterpiece, born of a mother's hands, tempered by sacrifice and resurrected in the hands of her son. The rival's face burned red when the verdict was announced. Students who once admired him now turned away, unwilling to even meet his eyes. Teachers who had excused his arrogance now spoke of him in tones of disappointment, shaking their heads at what he had become. His attempt at sabotage had not only failed, it had exposed the pettiness, the desperation, and the emptiness at his core. For the boy, the moment was bittersweet. The vindication brought relief, yes, but it also revealed just how fragile reputations could be. He realized that in this world, truth often needed to be fought for, defended tooth and nail against envy and malice. But he also realized that the bond between him and his mother had given him armor stronger than any accusation. The rival could smear his name, but he could not erase the truth carved into every note of that violin. In the days that followed, the academy buzzed with a new energy. Students spoke not just of the music but of integrity, of resilience, of the difference between those who built and those who schemed. The rival withdrew, shrinking into the shadows where his influence had once dominated. He had played his last card and in doing so, revealed himself for what he truly was. A coward who could not accept another's light without trying to extinguish it. The boy meanwhile carried on, not triumphant in arrogance but humbled in truth. He understood that greatness is not measured by applause or titles, but by the ability to withstand lies without faltering. And when he looked at his mother, he saw not just the builder of a violin, but the builder of an unshakable foundation, one that no rival's schemes could ever tear down. In the end, the rival's last move was not a strike against the boy. It was his own undoing, the final collapse of a life built on arrogance, unable to withstand the weight of truth. When the storm of accusations had finally passed, when the rival's schemes lay shattered and the academy had turned its gaze toward the truth, a strange calm settled over the boy's world. For the first time he could breathe without fear of losing what he had earned. Yet he could also sense that something larger than victory was unfolding. This was no longer about winning competitions or silencing rivals. It was about something deeper, something his mother had always known, something she had been carrying inside her like a secret waiting for the right moment to be spoken aloud. The night was quiet, save for the steady hum of the city beyond their small apartment window. The violin rested between them on the table, its varnished body catching the dim glow of the lamp. The boy studied it with reverence but also with questions that burned too hot to keep inside. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "Why spend all those nights building this for me when no one respected you? When everyone treated you as if you were invisible?" His mother did not answer right away. She poured tea into 2 chipped cups, the steam curling upward like smoke from a sacred fire. She handed him one, then sat across from him with her own. Her hands, calloused and lined from years of labor, wrapped around the warmth as though drawing strength from it. For a long time she stared at the violin as if seeing not wood and strings, but her own story etched into its curves. Finally she spoke, her voice slow, deliberate, heavy with the weight of years. "Respect is not given by wealth," she said, the words carrying a gravity that silenced even the boy's racing thoughts. "Respect is carved, piece by piece, through service, sacrifice, and love." The boy froze. He had heard her say many things but never this. Never with such clarity, never with such conviction. He leaned forward, trying to capture every word. She continued, her eyes distant, as if speaking not only to him but to the world beyond their walls. "I was once surrounded by applause," she confessed. "I crafted instruments for men in suits and women in gowns, for orchestras that filled golden halls. My hands built beauty, but the faces who praised me were quick to forget my name. They clapped for the music, not for the labor. They clapped for themselves, not for the hands that made their art possible. When my country fell into chaos, when the world turned upside down, I learned how fragile that kind of respect truly is. Money vanishes. Titles vanish. Fame fades quicker than smoke." Her voice trembled, not with weakness but with memory. "When we came here I worked tables. I scrubbed floors. People looked through me as if I were furniture. And for a while I let their scorn shape me. I thought I had become less. But do you know what I realized?" She raised her eyes to him, and in them shone a fire that no ridicule could extinguish. "I realized that every plate I carried, every hour I gave, every sacrifice I made for you, those were the truest acts of respect. Not for me, for you, for the life I wanted to give you. Respect is not the clapping of strangers. Respect is the foundation you build with your own 2 hands, even when nobody is watching." The boy's throat tightened. He thought of the nights he had been ashamed to be seen with her, ashamed of her apron, her tired posture, the faint smell of grease that clung to her uniform. He thought of the lies he told his classmates about what his mother did. And now, sitting before her, he felt the shame turn inward, not because of her work, but because of his blindness to its dignity. "You carved this violin," she said, pointing toward the instrument, "with me. Every night you stayed awake, every cut you made, every splinter that pierced your skin, you carved respect into it. Not because anyone gave it to you. Because you earned it. That is the only kind of respect that lasts." The boy's eyes blurred with tears. He picked up the violin, held it in his lap, and ran his fingers along its polished surface as if tracing the story she had just told. "I understand now," he whispered. "I see you. I see everything you gave up, everything you carried, everything you built." His mother smiled, but it was not a triumphant smile. It was soft, touched by sorrow and by peace. "Do not pity what I lost," she said. "I gained something greater than applause. I gained the chance to give you wings. And now you must decide how to fly, not with pride, not with arrogance, but with respect. Because one day, others will look at you the way you looked at me. And they will ask, what did he build? What did he sacrifice? What legacy did he leave?" The boy sat in silence, the weight of her words sinking deeper than any lecture, any lesson, any book he had ever read. This was no mere advice. It was a philosophy, an inheritance more valuable than gold. He realized then that his journey was no longer about proving himself to others. It was about honoring her truth, about living in such a way that her sacrifices became seeds, not shadows. Outside, the city buzzed with noise, but inside their small apartment, a new kind of music filled the air, the quiet symphony of understanding, of respect finally seen for what it was. The boy reached across the table and took his mother's hands in his. For the first time he did not see calluses or stains. He saw strength, artistry, and a love carved so deeply into him that it would never fade. "Respect," he said softly, repeating her words like a vow, "is carved piece by piece through service, sacrifice, and love." And in that moment he understood that the violin was not just an instrument, not just a tool for performance. It was a mirror of their lives, a reminder that beauty is not born from ease, but from labor, from loss, and from love strong enough to withstand them both. The boy held the violin close, but it was her philosophy he carried in his heart. A philosophy that would guide him not just on the stage but in every corner of his life. And though the world might one day forget his name, it would never erase the respect he carved with each note, each choice, each act of love that bore her spirit within it. The world had grown used to forgetting the people who built its beauty. Waiters carrying trays through crowded halls, janitors sweeping floors long after the guests had gone, seamstresses stitching gowns that dazzled under the lights, faces blurred, names erased. Yet every so often a story slipped through the cracks, one so human and so powerful that it refused to stay hidden. Hers was such a story. It began small. A journalist who had followed the competition, intrigued not only by the boy's performance but by the strange violin he carried, published an article titled, "The Violin of Sacrifice." The headline caught attention, but it was the story inside that made people stop scrolling. Readers learned of the mother who had once been a respected craftswoman, who lost everything when her country's turmoil forced her into exile, who worked tables by day and carved wood by night, and who built not just an instrument, but a bridge between her son's dream and her own endurance. The piece spread across local outlets first, igniting curiosity. Then the hashtags appeared. #Violin of Sacrifice, #Honor the Mothers. Social media, so often shallow and fleeting, latched onto something deeper. Clips of the boy playing the handmade violin flooded timelines, not because of technical perfection, but because of the weight of the story behind every note. Strangers wrote captions like, "She built more than an instrument, she built a future." Soon international journalists picked it up. The BBC ran a segment. Al Jazeera called it, "a modern parable of dignity." The New York Times asked whether society had lost its ability to value invisible labor until it was repackaged in art. In France, a magazine compared her to the mothers of early Impressionist painters, women who had pawned their jewelry to buy brushes and paint, yet whose names were buried under the fame of their sons. Across Asia, in markets and factories, workers saw her story and whispered, "She is one of us." In kitchens where immigrant women washed dishes late into the night, her picture appeared taped onto the walls, sometimes a grainy screenshot from a news clip, sometimes a sketch copied by hand. She became more than a mother, more than a violin maker. She became a symbol, proof that hidden talents, quiet sacrifices, and unnoticed love were forces powerful enough to bend the world's attention. What surprised even her was how quickly the story escaped her control. A group of migrant workers in Italy staged a small performance using instruments they had built out of discarded wood and metal. They called their concert, "The Orchestra of the Forgotten." Videos of it reached millions, with captions citing her as their inspiration. In Mexico, a collective of seamstresses launched a campaign showcasing their embroidery, signing each piece with their names for the first time, declaring, "We are not invisible." In Pakistan, bus drivers and rickshaw riders carried stickers of her quote, "Respect is carved piece by piece through service, sacrifice, and love." What began as admiration became a movement. Universities hosted panels about invisible labor in art. Students debated whether society's obsession with celebrity blinded them to the beauty created in kitchens, workshops, and factories. Activists marched with placards quoting her words, not demanding pity but recognition. At one rally, a sign read, "We build your world, see us." The boy watched all of this unfold with awe. He had thought his mother's story was his alone to carry, a private truth woven into their late-night hours at the table. Now he saw it reflected across continents, resonating with strangers who had never met her but somehow knew her intimately, because they too had carried burdens that went unseen. His performances drew larger crowds, but people came not just to hear his music. They came to glimpse the philosophy etched into each note. His mother, however, remained cautious. She did not bask in the sudden flood of admiration. To her, fame was a passing storm. "Let them speak," she told her son. "Let them find their strength in our story. But do not mistake attention for respect. Respect must still be carved, piece by piece." And yet she could not ignore the letters that began arriving, handwritten notes from across the globe. A young girl from Cairo wrote, "My mother works as a cleaner and I used to feel ashamed. But now I walk beside her with pride." A factory worker from Bangladesh said, "I thought my hands had no value. Today I see they are building my children's future." A man from Canada admitted, "I never thanked my father for the hours he spent fixing cars to pay for my education. Your story made me call him tonight." Each letter was a mirror, reflecting back the dignity she had once doubted. Each one was proof that her sacrifice had multiplied, rippling outward beyond borders, beyond languages, beyond her own life. Her rival, watching from the shadows, could not fathom it. He had measured value in applause, in trophies, in wealth. But here was a woman who had none of those, and yet the world had crowned her with something he could not buy: respect. His empire of arrogance looked small against the quiet revolution she had sparked. Governments took notice too. Some countries began offering new scholarships for the children of migrant workers, calling them the hidden talent grants. Nonprofits launched initiatives to provide artistic training to underprivileged youth, citing her story as their catalyst. Even in corporations, whispers began, "Perhaps we should see the people behind our products, not just the profits." One evening, as she sat with her son watching yet another news clip about workers inspired by her journey, he turned to her and asked, "Do you realize what you've done? You've started a movement." She shook her head gently. "I did not start it. It was already there waiting. People were already tired of being unseen. I only carved one violin. The rest they carved themselves." But even as she downplayed her role, history was already recording her name. In schools, teachers shared her story with children as a lesson not only about perseverance but about value, that dignity does not come from applause or wealth, but from the love and labor we put into the world. In time, the boy realized something extraordinary. His mother's philosophy had not only changed his life, it had changed the lives of thousands. It was no longer just their story, it was the world's. And as he held the violin on stage before audiences who now listened with reverence, he understood that every note he played carried not just his voice, but the voices of countless invisible hands finally being heard. The ripple had become a wave strong enough to cross oceans, to bridge borders, to remind humanity of something it had almost forgotten: that greatness is not reserved for the wealthy or the famous. It is carved, quietly, relentlessly, by ordinary people whose extraordinary love shapes the world in silence. And now, because of her, that silence was breaking. The invitations began arriving one after another, first from nearby cities, then from faraway capitals. Music halls that had once seemed untouchable, places where only the world's most renowned virtuosos had played, now opened their doors to him. His name was whispered among critics with admiration, yet what truly captivated the world was not just his technique, but the instrument he carried onto the stage. It was not a Stradivarius, nor a polished violin crafted by some celebrated European master. It was hers, the same handmade violin that had once been scoffed at, laughed off as a crude imitation. Its body bore the faint imperfections of late nights in a small apartment, its varnish uneven where her tired hands had brushed against the grain. But when the bow touched its strings, none of that mattered. The sound carried something no money could purchase. The echo of sacrifice, the weight of a mother's love, the endurance of dignity carved into wood. He refused to play without it. Agents and promoters, dazzled by the global stage, suggested he switch to a proper instrument, something that matched his new reputation. He declined every time. "This is my proper instrument," he would say. "Because without it I would not be here." Each performance became a ritual. Before stepping into the light, he would touch the violin gently as though greeting an old friend. And every bow stroke was not just music but testimony. He was telling the world, "See this sound? It was carved by hands that were unseen. Hear this melody? It was born from nights of exhaustion and quiet resilience. You do not just hear me, you hear her." Audiences understood. They rose to their feet not just for the sun, but for the invisible presence they felt hovering behind him. Some swore they could sense it, that the mother's spirit was there in the hall, guiding every note, steadying every chord. Critics described the performances as a dialogue between generations, a duet between sacrifice and triumph. In Vienna, where the greatest symphonies had once echoed, he performed a piece he dedicated to her. The final movement rose like a cry, fierce yet tender, ending in a whisper so delicate it felt like breath. The audience sat in silence long after the last note, as if unwilling to break the spell. When the applause finally came, it thundered through the hall, but he bowed not to them first. He turned to the wings where she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, tears slipping down her face. In New York, he performed at Carnegie Hall. The stage was drenched in light, the seats filled with people who had read about his story in newspapers, who had followed the movement his mother had unknowingly inspired. Cameras captured the gleam of the violin, its worn wood glowing like something sacred. When the concert ended, the crowd chanted her name as much as his. She was astonished, even embarrassed, but also deeply moved. For the first time in her life, the world had looked directly at her and said, "We see you." With every performance, the legend of the handmade violin grew. Children learning music begged their parents for instruments, like the mother's. Artisans around the world, often dismissed as minor craftsmen, began to proudly showcase their work, no longer ashamed that it lacked prestige. Her violin had elevated them all, reminding people that greatness did not require fame, only devotion. But for her, the true legacy was not the applause or the recognition. It was the quiet knowledge that her love had not been wasted, that every late night at the work table, every ache in her hands, had blossomed into something beyond her imagination. She had built a future for her son, but she had also helped build a new vision for the world. A vision where respect was earned not through wealth or status, but through service, sacrifice, and love. The son carried that vision everywhere he went. In interviews, when asked about technique or fame, he redirected the spotlight. "The violin you hear," he would say, "is my mother's voice. I am only the messenger." Journalists scribbled the words, but audiences felt them. His humility, echoing hers, made him not just an artist but a vessel of her philosophy. Years passed and still he refused to let the violin out of his sight. Conservators offered to preserve it in museums. Curators pleaded to display it as a historical artifact. He refused gently but firmly. "It is not an artifact," he said. "It is alive. It must be played." And so with every bow stroke, the violins would absorb more stories, more applause, more unspoken prayers. In Tokyo, an elderly man approached after a performance, bowing low before speaking. "When I was young, my mother worked in silence to send me to school. I never thanked her properly. Tonight, through your music, I heard her voice again." The boy, Tawa man, embraced him. It was in such moments that he realized the violin was no longer only theirs. It belonged to everyone who had ever been unseen, everyone who had ever sacrificed in silence. The legacy crystallized in one unforgettable night. At a global peace summit, leaders from dozens of nations gathered in a grand hall. He had been invited to perform as a symbol of resilience. When he stepped onto the stage, silence fell. He played not a flashy concerto, but a simple melody his mother used to hum while working, one that had comforted him as a child. The notes rose gently, weaving through the hall, piercing the polished exterior of diplomats and dignitaries. Many wiped their eyes before they realized tears had fallen. When the final note faded, he lifted the violin high as if presenting it to the world. And for the first time he spoke directly to the audience. This violin was built by hands that were told they had no value. But tonight, those same hands sing louder than any voice of power. May we remember always that the truest legacies are carved not by the wealthy or the mighty, but by those who give without expecting anything in return. The hall erupted in applause, not just for him, not just for the performance, but for her, for every unseen worker, every silent parent, every overlooked craftsman whose labor had shaped humanity. She sat in the front row, trembling with emotion. The spotlight brushed her face, and though she wished to shrink away, she allowed herself for the first time to be seen fully. Her eyes met her son's, and in that gaze, all the years of struggle melted into pride. From that night forward, whenever he played, the world no longer asked about his fame or his brilliance. They asked about her. About the woman who had carved wood in the shadows and, through love, had carved a path that spanned the globe. Thus, the violin became more than an instrument. It became a relic of living love, a reminder that music at its core is not about perfection but about truth. And each time the bow touched the strings, each note soared like a tribute, a whispered thank you, echoing across borders, carrying with it the eternal truth. Respect is carved piece by piece through service, sacrifice, and love. And in that truth her legacy would live forever. He thought she was just a waitress. Just a woman in a simple apron, carrying trays, refilling cups, offering tired smiles to strangers who would never remember her name. To most of the world she was invisible, part of the background noise of life. But behind that quiet exterior she was building something extraordinary, not with money, not with status, but with grit, dignity, and love. History is rarely carved in grand gestures. It is built in the shadows, in the long nights when no one is watching, in the sacrifices that seemed thankless at the time. She didn't wear crowns or hold titles. She wasn't celebrated in newspapers or paraded in public squares. Yet piece by piece, moment by moment, she was shaping a future, one that the world would one day applaud. And when her son finally stood on the greatest stages of the world, when his music reached ears that had never known their names, he carried with him her story. The story of a mother who refused to be defined by what others saw. She was not just anything. She was the architect of his destiny, the craftsman of his instrument, the author of a legacy that will outlive both of them. That's the truth at the heart of this journey. How easily we underestimate the unseen. How often we dismiss the sacrifices made in silence. How casually we label someone as ordinary, without realizing they may be carrying entire futures in their weary hands. This story isn't only about a mother and her son. It's about all of us. It's about the parents who give without asking for recognition. The fathers who work 2 shifts so their children never feel hunger. The mothers who patch clothes instead of buying new ones so there's enough left over for school books. The grandparents who carry the weight of tradition and prayer so their families have an anchor in a restless world. These are the invisible architects of history. Maybe in your own life, you've overlooked someone like her. Maybe there's a parent, a guardian, or even a teacher or mentor whose sacrifices seemed small at the time, but were, in truth, monumental. We don't always see the greatness of love until years later, when we realize that everything we are stands on the shoulders of someone who gave more than they had to give. So pause here. Reflect. Who carried you when you could not walk alone? Who worked quietly in the background so you could step into the light? Whose hands shaped your story even when no one clapped for them? Because if there's one lesson this journey leaves us with, it's this. The world is too quick to measure value by wealth, by fame, by outward power. But real value is measured in sacrifice, in service, in love that expects nothing in return. That's what built the violin. That's what built the music. That's what built history. And here's where you come in. If you believe every parent's sacrifice deserves honor, if you believe that behind every success story there is someone who gave silently, invisibly yet profoundly, then don't let this story end here. Share it. Tell others. Carry it forward. Because in sharing, you're not just passing along one family's story, you're validating the millions of untold stories that echo quietly in kitchens, factories, farms, and classrooms all around the world. Share it for the waitress who is more than just a waitress. Share it for the father who drives a rickshaw, the the mother who sells fruit by the roadside, the grandmother who prays quietly for her family every night. Share it for the countless unnamed builders of tomorrow who will never see their own names in lights, but who make it possible for others to shine. And more than sharing, live it. Honor the sacrifices in your own family. Say thank you while you still can. Call the person you've been meaning to call. Write that message. Visit the one who waits silently for your recognition. Do not wait until applause comes too late. Because history is not only written in books or etched in monuments. History is also written in the memory of gratitude. Every time you recognize a sacrifice, every time you honor someone who thought they were invisible, you are helping to carve the kind of world where no love is wasted, no service forgotten. She built history with her hands. He carried it with his music. And now it's in your hands. What will you do with it? If this story has moved you, don't let it stop at emotion. Transform that emotion into action. Share this story with others, not for views, not for numbers, but for remembrance. Because maybe, just maybe, it will remind someone else to look differently at the people they take for granted. Maybe it will spark a thank you that has been waiting too long. And if you felt the weight of sacrifice yourself, if you are the mother, the father, the silent worker, then let this be your validation. You may not always hear applause. You may not always see recognition. But know this, what you are building in love does not disappear. It lives. It echoes. It will outlast you. So the next time you hear someone say, "She's just a waitress," remember this story. Remember her violin. Remember that nothing built in love is ever small. Because she was never just anything. She was a builder of history. And so are you. If you believe every parent's sacrifice deserves honor, share this story. Subscribe for more stories that remind us of unseen greatness. And before you go, call or thank someone in your own life who carried you when no one else could.